I am not afraid of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is ahead of us, afraid of us, and that's why he keeps tweeting all the time. If he doesn't mention you, you got a big problem.
Bloomberg came in and he multiplied it times 10. If you were a black person walking down the street, you were going to be stopped and frisked under Bloomberg.
There are still a half dozen Democrats running for president, but right now Donald Trump is focused on Mike Bloomberg and vice versa. Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It is Friday, February 14th. It's Valentine's Day. Do you guys remember? With us, we have White House reporter for the Associated Press, Jonathan Lemire. Did you remember?
I know it's Valentine's Day.
You better not mess this up.
Happy Valentine's Day,
Okay.
Mika.
Oh, well, thank you. But I'm thinking of your wife. You need to bring flowers. MSNBC political analyst and former chairman of the Republican National Committee, Michael Steele. Do you remember Michael?
I'm working on it.
Oh, boy. Historian and author of The Soul of America, and Rogers Professor of the Presidency at Vanderbilt University, John Meacham, is joining us. He's an NBC News and MSNBC contributor. He just ran out the door to get some flowers. And former U.S. attorney, now an NBC News law enforcement analyst, Chuck Rosenberg, who I know remembered, and former Justice Department spokesman, now an MSNBC Justice and Security analyst, Matt Miller, is with us. Joe's away with his kids for this President's Day weekend. Willie also taking a well-deserved morning off, having, I think he worked like 3 weeks straight, and I'm here on Valentine's Day. Okay, we begin with what appears to be another instance of quid pro quo by President Trump. There's a lot to get to, so we're just diving in. It's the same issue that got him impeached in the first place. Before a meeting with New York Governor Andrew Cuomo yesterday, President Trump put out a tweet that appeared to link his administration's decision to freeze New York's access to the Trusted Traveler program with a demand that the state drop a myriad of lawsuits against him and his administration. He's just doing it in plain sight. Why not, right? He wrote this: I'm seeing Governor Cuomo today at the White House, and he must understand that national security far exceeds politics. New York must stop all of its unnecessary lawsuits and harassment, start cleaning itself up, and lowering taxes. Yeah, New York's Attorney General Letitia James has issued a subpoena for Trump's financial records and has filed a number of lawsuits against the Trump administration and the Trump organization. She responded to the president's tweet, writing, when you stop violating the rights and liberties of all New Yorkers, we will stand down. Until then, we have a duty and responsibility to defend the Constitution and the rule of law. By the way, I filed the lawsuits, not the governor. Gosh, I'm just wondering. It's just so weird what we see happening here. And I wonder if anyone could have seen this coming. Cue House impeachment manager Hakeem Jeffries from just 2 weeks ago.
What we have alleged in this case is that the president solicited a personal political benefit in exchange for an official act, solicited dirt on a political opponent in exchange for the release of $391 million in military aid, solicited dirt in exchange for a White House meeting. And if this Senate were to say that's acceptable, then precisely as was outlined in that question could take place all across America in the context of the next election and any election. Grants allocated to cities or towns or municipalities across the country. But the president could say, you're not going to get that money, Mr. Mayor, Mrs. County Executive, Mrs. Town Supervisor, unless you endorse me for re-election. The president could say that to any governor of our 50 states. That's unacceptable. That cannot be allowed to happen in our democratic republic.
Chuck Rosenberg, it seemed so ludicrous when Hakeem Jeffries made that example of what potentially could happen. And yet, as of yesterday, it has. What's the recourse? What's your take moving forward?
Well, first of all, it's not that hard to predict that the president will be illogical and petulant, Mika. And by the way, I don't know if you can put his tweet back up, but there is a rank inconsistency within it. First, he says that national security is much more important than politics. And in the very next sentence, there's the rank politics, right? In the very next sentence, after talking about the primacy of national security, there comes the threat. If he doesn't get what he wants, a cessation to the lawsuits that have been filed against him and his organizations by New York State, then he's going to exact revenge. Mr. Jeffries was spot on. I give him some credit for that. But this has been a pattern that we have seen over and over and over again, and I think it's deeply disturbing.
So, Jonathan Lemire, so much has happened. We started with this. There are many other things that happened yesterday that we could have started with, given the Attorney General's comments later in the day, which we'll get to. But we've got a situation now where the president's appearing to be issuing quid pro quos in real time on Twitter. What are you hearing from the White House and from your sources in Washington?
Yeah, I mean, he's doing so in plain sight. There's very little attempt to cover this. Now, we know that the president has had sort of a pretty contentious relationship with Governor Cuomo and most of the New York State officials because most of them are Democrat. And, of course, there have been a series of investigations that the state has run in addition to what's been going on in the House of Representatives. So that is something that the president has been irritated about for a while. Let's recall, of course, he even sort of renounced his citizenship of the state of New York and is now considered a citizen of Florida, in part because of how upset he was with how things are going on with those officials. Now, what is happening here is exactly what Representative Jeffries implied. This seems to be a quid pro quo offer right in front. He took away this program, the Global Entry Program, a few weeks ago. He's now suggesting he's trying to put it back on the table if these investigations stop, and he gets a cheap shot at the governor's brother while he's at it. Now, the governor, there was no deal struck yesterday from what we've heard. Certainly, Letitia James, the attorney general here in New York, is the one who spoke out forcefully against it. But this is also a window into how the president's feeling right now, post-impeachment. Completely emboldened, unchecked. We saw what's happened in the few days after that verdict. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman marched out of the White House in front of the camera so people could see. Ambassador Sondland also relieved of his duties. He's weighed in on the Roger Stone sentencing, which I know we'll get to a little more in a moment. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. He has told people around him, as we've written this week, that he feels like not only did he survive impeachment, but he's come out stronger than ever because no one in the Republican Party, except for Mitt Romney, dared stand up to him.
So we've seen a pattern here. And Michael Steele, it's the president can't take a win. He can't take a win when he's gotten his way, when he's gotten through something. He can't take a win. Right. He actually doubles down and gets worse, which leads me to Susan Collins, I believe, saying, well, I believe the president has learned a lesson. Well, no, he's doing it again in plain sight. The Republicans own this, but do they care?
No, they don't. And large measure because, they've saddled up with the president in terms of, the way all of these things play out. On the first part of this, you get on the other side of impeachment and what you see is the president now wanting to exact his revenge. He wants to settle the score. This is not over until he says it's over, until he feels that he's made his point after those who, perceive as come after him have done so. So you have that. Republicans still sit there stymied by the whole thing where you have a Susan Collins telling us, oh, well, he's going to learn from this. The president doesn't learn anything from these exercises as he sees them. He sets his own course. So, as I've said before, the important thing, Mika, is what do we learn from it? Yeah. What do we get away from this? Because that's the important part of this. We know Trump is not going to learn anything because he doesn't want to. I mean, he set his course, his mind in a certain direction. So what are we taking away from this? And what will be our next move as government, as citizens, as the state of New York? And how do we now adapt on this playing field, if you will, to what the president is doing with the the perp walks of career soldiers from service, et cetera.
All right. Well, we're just going to keep moving through this incredible set of events in the past 24 hours. President Trump has now attacked the lead juror in the case that ended with his friend Roger Stone's conviction. Trump tweeted, quote, "Now it looks like the foreperson in the jury in the Roger Stone case had significant bias. Add that to everything else, and this is not looking good for the quote Justice Department." Puts that in quotes. The attack came a day after former Memphis School Board President Tamika Hart identified herself as the lead juror in a Facebook post. Hart said she's been silent since the November 2019 conviction out of concern for her safety, but decided to speak out in defense of the 4 prosecutors who quit after the case after the Department of Justice overrode their recommendation. Hart also defended her own work, posting to Facebook this: "As foreperson, I made sure we went through every element of every charge, matching the evidence presented in the case that led us to return a conviction of guilty on all 7 counts." Since identifying herself, the president's allies in the media have dredged up old social media posts they claim to show bias. Hart did run for Congress as a Democrat in 2012, but Stone's defense knew that when they cleared her to serve on the jury. Meanwhile, the Chief Justice of the Federal District Court in Washington issued a rare public response to Trump's attacks. The judges of this court base their sentencing decisions on careful consideration of the actual record in the case before them, the applicable sentencing guidelines and statutory factors, the submissions of the parties, the probation office and victims, and their own judgment and experience. Public criticism or pressure is not a factor. Let's stop right here. Chuck Rosenberg, I want to hear your thoughts.
Well, first of all, Judge Howell is spot on. That's exactly right. I'm not concerned, Mika, that in this particular case, the outcome of the sentencing will be unfair. In fact, Judge Jackson is a well-respected jurist. She's smart and she's tough. It will be a fair outcome. What worries me is that the perception of the outcome will be fair. See, the Department of Justice has to be two things: objectively fair and perceived as fair. And when the president weighs in on a case about a friend of his and asks the Justice Department to do a particular thing, which it then does, that goes to the perception of fairness. And Judge Howell and Judge Jackson, by the way, we heard this from Chief Justice Roberts, have spoken out about the men and women who comprise the federal judges across the country and how they don't succumb to pressure and how this thing doesn't work. But the public doesn't necessarily know that. And so the president put the judge in a terrible situation because it either looks like she's capitulating to the president if she sentences Mr. Stone lower than the guidelines call for, or that she's rebuffing him if she does not. When in fact, all she's going to do is her job. She's going to be just and she's going to be fair. The outcome will be fair. I worry about the perception.
So all of this brings us to the so-called bar fight.
Love it.
Yeah. The Attorney General saying in a new interview with ABC News that the president's comments and tweets make it, quote, impossible for him to do his job. William Barr insists he was not asked by the president or anyone from the White House to intervene in the Stone case. Barr says he spoke to the U.S. attorney before the sentencing memo was turned in and advised him not to recommend a 7 to 9 year prison sentence, but instead to defer to the judge. Here's what the Attorney General says happened after claiming the U.S. attorney defied him.
On Monday night, when I first saw the news reports, I said, gee, the news is spinning this. This is not what we were going to do.
So you were surprised?
I was very surprised. And once I confirmed that that's actually what we filed, I said that night to my staff that we had to get ready because we had to do something in the morning to amend that and clarify what our position was. I had made a decision that I thought was fair and reasonable in this particular case. And once the tweet occurred, the question is, well, now what do I do? And do you go forward with what you think is the right decision, or do you pull back because of the tweet? And that just sort of illustrates how disruptive these tweets can be.
So you're saying you have a problem with the tweets?
Yes, well, I have a problem with some of the tweets. I'm happy to say that, in fact, the president has never asked me to do anything in a criminal case. However, to have public statements and tweets made about the department, about our people in the department, our men and women here, about cases pending in the department, and about judges before whom we have cases, make it impossible for me to do my job.
The White House press secretary released the following statement in response. The president wasn't bothered by the comments at all, and he has the right, just like any American citizen, to publicly offer his opinions. President Trump used his social media very effectively to fight for the American people against injustices in our country, including the fake news. The president has full faith and confidence in Attorney General Barr to do his job and uphold the law. Okay, Matt Miller, I've been really thinking about these comments, which seem to really push back against the president at first. At first, it's like, whoa, what's going on here? Is he stepping away a little bit? Is he a little bruised by all the criticism he's gotten because the legal community in Washington is so tight? But it seems to me that what he's saying is that these tweets make it harder for Bill Barr to help him be corrupt. What's your gut?
I think you have it exactly right, Mika. Look, Bill Barr often has a way of saying all the words that you want to hear out of an attorney general. If you just kind of go back in time and put the words he said yesterday in Jeff Sessions' mouth, that's exactly what we always wanted to hear from Jeff Sessions. We wanted to see him pushing back against the president's attacks on the Justice Department. The problem with Barr is his words about independence and the fact that he can't be bullied and the fact that he's going to do what's right in the traditions of the department are never backed up by his actions. And so when I see him yesterday, what I hear is when he says, you're making it impossible for me to do my job, he means you're not giving me the political space to operate to do all the things you want me to do, Donald Trump. I think that Barr has made it very clear that his interests and the president's interests are aligned. He will squash investigations into the president when he can, when it's too late to squash them, as in the case of Mike Flynn and Roger Stone and even the Mueller report. He will steer them in the president's direction. He will launch investigations into the president's enemies, as he's done with Jim Comey and as he seems to be doing against John Brennan with this investigation into the origins of the original election interference. He will do all these things for the president, but he needs the president to shut up and stop messing it up by talking about it publicly. Because what happens when the president does that, he starts a revolt inside the Justice Department. And I suspect what Barr was doing yesterday was trying to quell that internal revolt that we saw start this week when 4 prosecutors removed their names. He's just telling the president, if you would just be quiet, I will give you what you want, but you have to give me the space I need.
Let me hear.
John Meacham, the White House, at least so far, is speaking with one voice, those close to the president, so insisting that he's not upset by these comments, and that may be, if this is indeed the play that we just described. But we also know the president doesn't react well to negative media coverage, and as more that we see Barr's comments played over and over the next few days, I think we might be hearing from him. But my question to you is about this. In the White House statement there, they said the president, like any American, has the right to voice his opinion. John Meacham, fact check this for me. Is he, the president, like any American? And if he's not, why is this so inconsequential?
Yeah, no, that part of the phrase jumped out at me. And boy, you wonder which editor in the White House added, including the fake news.
Yeah.
I wonder if that was put in Sharpie. It sort of has that feel, doesn't it? The remarkable thing about the president is his capacity to, and it's epic, even in presidential terms, his encyclopedic grasp of grudges and his ability to hold them and weaponize them going forward. Mrs. John Kelly this week, right? Remembering a conversation. Congresswoman Dingell, he alleges, they had this phone call about Chairman Dingell's funeral. There's this remarkable internal taping system that spews out everything that the world as he wants to see it. And he's not just like every other citizen, to go straight to your point. John Adams in 1790 wrote that the president, the first character, was going to be the object of all eyes, the object of all attention. And that creates an enormous amount of responsibility. But at this point, we're so far into this, we know that the presidency is not going to change him. For us, it seems to me, to go to Michael's point, it's now on us in a large measure and on Republicans in most significant measure to decide whether he's changed the presidency itself and whether he's changed our public culture forever. I've been basically optimistic for almost 4 years now that I would take James Madison over Twitter. I'm less so now as things go on. There were a number of Republicans I thought would stand up at the last possible moment and say enough. And as you played Congressman Jeffries' statement, you have this remarkable moment where the train is blowing past rapidly. And what folks are going to have to decide at a certain point is, do you want a president picking on judges, trying to change cases? The two things, my two check boxes that were going to be break the glass kind of emergencies, were going to be, was he going to try to remove a judge? Would he ever try to overturn a verdict unilaterally? And would he try to postpone an election? These were the two things to watch out for. And he's getting awfully close on the first.
Well, I mean, at this point, I think we can safely say, if there's a question that begins with, would he ever do A, B, or C? The answer's yes. So it's up for Republicans to decide how much exactly can you live with. Coming up on Morning Joe, a lot more to get to here. We reported the news that John Kelly made right at the top of our show yesterday as soon as it crossed, but there was a lot more to what the retired general had to say about the president, and we will paint the full picture straight ahead. But first, let's go right to Bill Cairns with a check on the forecast. Bill?
Good morning to you, Mika. We haven't had many forecasts with Arctic blast or how cold it is, and that this is one of those days. It's not going to last long, but today is a very cold morning. 26 million people under wind chill advisories, a few under wind chill warnings. The worst of it's still in the Central Plains, but it's much colder today in the Ohio Valley and in areas of the South than it was yesterday, and it's all heading for the Northeast today. This is the coldest morning in Dallas in 3 months here at 19 degrees. Chicago feels like negative 16, and it's getting chillier. D.C. right now feels like 29. Later on today, it'll feel like in the teens. In other words, grab all that winter gear. So here's today's forecast. At least there's not a lot of rain or snow out there, just a little bit for our friends in areas of Florida. And as far as your weekend outlook goes, after a very cold start in the Northeast Saturday morning, the sun will be out and it'll slowly warm up. The worst weather's in the Pacific Northwest with another storm coming through. And then Sunday on the East Coast, we warm it up, already back up into the 50s in areas like Washington, D.C. Little rain for our friends there on the Gulf Coast and some mountain snow from that storm that moved onto the West Coast on Saturday. Overall, looks like a pretty quiet weekend after a very chilly start. New York City, grab that hat and gloves. It'll be much colder this afternoon. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
So you want to be president? I've watched many candidates run for their party's nomination, but only a few knew how to get it.
I am paying for this microphone.
My podcast is about what it takes to get the nomination. 6 episodes, 6 timeless themes that separate the few winners from the many losers.
The hope still lives, and the dream shall never die.
So You Want to Be President with Chris Matthews, an MSNBC podcast. Search now wherever you're listening and subscribe. Episode 4 available now.
So you want to be president? I've watched many candidates run for their party's nomination, but only a few knew how to get it.
I feel your pain.
My podcast is about what it takes to get the nomination. 6 episodes, 6 timeless themes that separate the few winners from the many losers.
This campaign was and will remain the great honor of my life.
So You Want to Be President with Chris Matthews, an MSNBC podcast. Search now wherever you're listening and subscribe. Episode 4 available now.
Back to Morning Joe, now to more fallout from former White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, who uncharacteristically eviscerated President Trump on a host of foreign and domestic issues. According to The Atlantic, Kelly unleashed his misgivings about Trump's behavior at an event on Wednesday, sounding at times like the anti-Trump, on the topic of immigration, a key initiative in which he was responsible for advancing. Kelly said that Trump's border wall doesn't need to extend from, quote, sea to shining sea. He also disapproved of Trump's language about migrants, explaining that most are merely looking for jobs. Quote, in fact, they're overwhelmingly good people. They're not all rapists and they're not all murderers, and it's wrong to characterize them that way. I disagreed with the president a number of times. The retired Marine Corps general also faulted Trump for meddling in the case of Eddie Gallagher, a Navy SEAL who was convicted of posing with the corpse of an ISIS fighter. Kelly said, quote, the idea that the commander-in-chief intervened there, in my opinion, was exactly the wrong thing to do. Had I been there, I think I could have prevented it. And on North Korea, Kelly said that the country's rogue leader, Kim Jong-un, will, quote, never give his nuclear weapons up. Kelly added, quote, President Trump tried. That's one way to put it, but it didn't work. I never did think Kim would do anything other than play us for a while, and he did that fairly effectively. President Trump responded to the barrage of criticism from his former cabinet member, tweeting yesterday, I mean, I don't even, is it worth reading? Well, when I terminated John Kelly, which I couldn't do fast enough, he knew full well that he was way over his head. Being chief of staff just wasn't for him. He came in with a bang, went out with a whimper, but like so many exes, really, you'd know, he misses the action and just can't keep his mouth shut, which he actually has a military and legal obligation to do. His incredible wife, Karen, who I have a lot of respect for, once pulled me aside and said, strongly, that John respects you greatly. When we are no longer here, he will only speak well of you. Wrong. Well, it must have been so bad that he just couldn't help himself. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton, who has also recently spoken out about his time in the Trump administration, sprang to Kelly's defense, tweeting, quote, John Kelly is an honorable man. John and I have disagreed at times, as is commonplace at senior government levels, but he has always served his country faithfully. Conservatives, especially, have a responsibility to reject baseless attacks upon him. Jonathan Lemire, the president, is pushing the buttons of people who were frustrated working for him and kept their mouths shut. But you know what? I think that at some point, somebody's just going to pop.
Yeah,
They're not going to be able to take it anymore.
Perhaps one small fact check. I mean, John Kelly certainly largely agreed with the president on his immigration policy, maybe objected to the rhetoric, but he certainly didn't object to some
and the human feeling about the way he was characterizing people.
Right, and that is what he's saying now. But certainly, you know, John Kelly, for the first few months in his time as chief of staff, was able to impose some sort of rigor and discipline to the Oval Office. It didn't last, and by the end, Trump and Kelly would have shouting matches that could be heard throughout the West Wing as Trump became very frustrated with Kelly's attempts to control him, and then eventually reduced his power and moved him out the door. Michael Steele, let's bring you in on this. I mean, this is certainly John Kelly was very frank in his criticisms here. But my question is, a couple for you. One is, what took him so long? And if he felt this, and say, wouldn't this have been more useful perhaps during the impeachment trial that just concluded? And then lastly, where's everyone else? Why are we still have not heard candidly from former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, former Secretary of State James Mattis, among others?
Probably because book deals haven't been signed yet, or, you know, made-for-TV movies haven't been negotiated. I appreciate all of this after the fact. We just went through an impeachment where John Kelly's, insights about the character and nature of how this White House operates. Certainly, any information relevant to the articles of impeachment would have been helpful. This was a paid speech, and the audience got what they paid for, and so that's fine. I mean, it's just, there probably will be more, Mika, who will come out and say something once all of the right deals are negotiated. But the country can't wait for that, and that's the part that's so bothersome, is that these are individuals who were in the room at the table, and have information that just a few weeks ago, maybe would have moved a Republican
Right.
senator or two.
And that's the part, Michael, that's so frustrating. It's like, I guess there's no reason to begrudge someone for making money, but...
No, I don't want to do that, but still, the country needed you.
Yeah. John Meacham,
the country needed you.
I move to you now. I'm scared to ask, but I'm thinking the answer is no. Is there a parallel to this moment in history?
Of everyone around the president thinking that he's dangerous to the republic?
Yeah,
Is that the moment you mean?
That one.
No, I think we're pretty much past where the buses run, as we say in the South. There's some feel about the very last days of Nixon. A lot of these kinds of details came out in books like The Final Days. But part of what was striking about those is they were new and unique at the time. The idea of a president being out of control in a nuclear age in particular. This hasn't been, the Trump factor on this is now just entirely part of our daily vernacular. And you had a great point a moment ago. Whenever you start a sentence, I'm not going to call this the Mika doctrine. Whenever you have a sentence, would he ever? The answer is yeah.
Yes.
And you can move on. So this is a deeply serious moment. This establishment idea that these generals, these folks from the experienced ranks, Mattis, Kelly, and others, that they were the guardrails and that everything was going to be fine. I think that time and chance now have shown us that fundamentally it matters enormously who's behind that desk and what half the country is willing to put up with. And that's the one piece of slightly good news here is it doesn't take many people in the upcoming elections to flip this. It's, you're talking about a very narrow margin of the right people in the right number of states. We've had 7 presidential elections since 1992. In a majority of those elections, the person who became president did not get above 50% of the vote. We are an incredibly divided country, which is at once scary, but it also offers an opportunity.
Well, with what you just said, we will be having a conversation ahead about what's going on with the Democrats and also a separate conversation that's connected about Mike Bloomberg. But let's move through this all methodically. A federal judge sided with Amazon yesterday over the disputed Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure Cloud contract, putting a temporary block on the contract that was awarded to Microsoft back in October. Yesterday, a court notice announced the injunction, but it was not made public for an undisclosed reason. The Jedi Cloud contract's purpose is to modernize the Pentagon's IT operations and could be worth up to $10 billion over 10 years. The Department of Defense had been deciding between granting the contract to Amazon or Microsoft and ultimately went with Microsoft on October 25th. Last month, Amazon disputed that decision, arguing that the evaluation process had clear deficiencies, errors, and unmistakable bias. Amazon claimed that President Trump showed personal bias, as he has often made Amazon, their CEO Jeff Bezos, and the newspaper Bezos owns, the Washington Post, part of his pointed attacks. And in the summer of 2018, President Trump reportedly told then Defense Secretary James Mattis to screw Amazon out of a bid, that's a quote, by the way, for the coveted contract, which Joe predicted, by the way, back in November. It would prevent the contract from holding up if in court if challenged. So Matt Miller and then Chuck, I mean, a lot going on here as we focus on the notion of courts that are really being put under strain here, but so far holding up.
Yeah, holding up in this case, I think the common thread that runs through this story and everything else we've talked about is the president's abuse of power. I mean, to use the newly coined Mika doctrine, if the president shouldn't be able to do that, but yes, he's willing to. In the same way he's willing to reach into a state and try to withhold a program that benefits the citizens of that state because he's mad at what its political leader's done. It's not an appropriate use of power. It's certainly not an appropriate use of his power to reach into the Pentagon's contracting process, which is supposed to be completely apolitical, and use that process to try to target one of his perceived political enemies. And it's not. It's good to see, the third branch of government still holding because, we see the second branch of government. We see the legislative branch completely cave into the president and being unwilling to stand up to him in any way. And that leaves us just with the courts. The question ultimately is always whether the Supreme Court is willing to do the same. And I think I'm sad to say that in most cases they haven't. And I suspect that the president in all of these cases that go to the courts thinks, I may lose here in the district court. I may lose in the appeals court. But at the end, I have 5 votes on the Supreme Court. And I'm probably going to get away with whatever I want in the same way that Republicans in the Senate will let me get away with whatever I want.
Chuck Rosenberg, a little chilling here. to me.
It is chilling. And look, and there's significant risk. It did shake me a bit to hear that one of my favorite historians and authors, John Meacham, that his optimism is fading. But I still retain maybe a childlike faith in the courts of the United States. Mika, I spent most of my professional life in those courts. And as Chief Justice Roberts said, I didn't know if the judges, or I should say, I didn't know or care if the judges in front of whom I was practicing were appointed by Republicans or Democrats. It really didn't matter. And I don't think it affected the outcome of the cases I was trying. And so I don't think the third branch of government is just holding. I actually think it's flourishing. You know, Matt may well be right. The president might have 5 votes on certain issues in the Supreme Court and may prevail on an issue or two. But in the courts of the United States, my experience is that you get justice. And thank God they're still there. And we see now judges doing something extraordinarily unusual, which is speaking up. Not just Chief Justice Roberts on behalf of the Supreme Court, but the Chief Judge in the District of Columbia, District Court, Beryl Howell, you know, coming to the defense of the men and women who are our jurists. I think our courts are flourishing. Whatever havoc the president wreaks on the executive branch and maybe by extension on the legislative branch, I don't think he's going to undermine the courts of the United States.
Let's hold on to that childlike faith. Chuck Rosenberg and Matthew Miller, thank you both for your insight this morning.
Hey guys, Willie Geist here. This week on the Sunday Sit Down podcast, I get together with Golden Globe-winning actor Ewan McGregor to talk about a prolific career that includes his latest role in the superhero film Birds of Prey. Get that conversation now for free wherever you download your podcasts.
Somebody said, that he's taller than me, calls me Little Mike. And the answer is, Donald, where I come from, we measure your height from your neck up. I am not afraid of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is ahead of us, afraid of us, and that's why he keeps tweeting all the time. If he doesn't mention you, you got a big problem.
Michael Bloomberg yesterday at a campaign event in North Carolina after his long, insult-laden Twitter fight with President Trump. Meanwhile, a new Morning Consult national poll has Senator Bernie Sanders in the lead, up 4 points since before the New Hampshire primary, and 10 points ahead of former frontrunner Joe Biden. Biden is statistically tied with former Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who is at 18% of support. Both sit within the poll's 2-point margin of error. Joining us now, Donnie Deutsch, former chief of staff to the DCCC and former director of strategic communications for Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign, Adrian Elrod, and Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and associate editor of the Washington Post and MSNBC political analyst, Eugene Robinson. Okay, so let's just take this apart one by one because we're looking at Mike Bloomberg as a potential disruptor in this race. But I'm going to lay it out because we've been sort of edging around these stories. Stop and frisk, the big apology. Do y'all remember when he wanted a third term and just changed the rules? Okay, so these are the parts that concern me, right? At the same time, on guns and on governing, he's qualified. I just wonder who can talk to me. In fact, Michael Steele, I'll start with you. Is Bloomberg getting a close enough look early enough on?
It's starting to happen, Mika, and you see it bubbling in 2 spaces right now. Certainly one in the broader national conversation. Reporters are beginning to dig a little bit back into his background, replay some of those stories, move them forward to sort of contextualize them in terms of how he's running his campaign and what kind of president he would be on certain issues. And in the African American community, where he's really caused a roil because of the way Joe Biden has just imploded. I mean, complete flatline at this point.
Well,
look,
really,
South Carolina is not going to be enough of a wall for Joe Biden at this point. Absolutely. And a lot of African Americans you're seeing starting to pull off of him is creating this kind of regurgitation, if you will, of the Mike Bloomberg era in New York City.
Wow. Okay, Jonathan.
Well, certainly at the moment where polls suggest that Mike Bloomberg is making inroads into cutting away at Joe Biden's lead among African-American voters, there's been a scrutiny on his record with those same people from his time in New York City. I covered him here for years, including, as Mika said, that third term, where he worked to have the city charter overturned. He was able to run for 4 more years, making the argument that because of the economic collapse that he needed a steady hand at the wheel. And then after he had those 4 years, he won by a much smaller margin that time around, by the way. And those 4 years were somewhat uninspiring compared to his previous 8. They changed it back. So therefore, no one else can do that. And that's to Mika's point. But Donnie, you've lived here for a long time. You've obviously, you've watched him closely. But isn't it? He's going to have to talk about his record with African American voters. And it's stop and frisk with the apology that many people sort of dismissed as perhaps very politically motivated. The unearthing of the audio tape this week that just had him a couple years ago, still defending the practice, and the story that my colleagues at the Associated press broke this week about how he suggested that redlining, the end of redlining, was part to blame for that economic collapse. How is he going to answer for all this? Do we think that he's going to be able to continue to build traction with these African-American voters who are so key to a Democratic nomination?
Yeah, I said this in November when it was at 1 or 2%. I actually think he's going to end up being the candidate. And here are the reasons why in particular. Number one, you're seeing already, and now he's at national polls at 18%. I know national polls don't mean anything, but they do when you start to look at things. It's the media economy scale self-fulfilling prophecy. There is so much money. When I say so much, he can spend $5 billion, and that would be what he made last year. Okay? That is the amount of money. That tonnage, as we call in the advertising business, is so persuasive, particularly because he has a story to tell. He has a story to tell on guns. Right. He has a story to tell on healthcare. He's got a story to tell on the economy. He's got a story to tell on climate change. The other thing he has is the ultimate Trump antidote. Here's Trump's biggest weapon right now. That 60% of the people in this country, according to Gallup, think we're going in the right direction. And that's about the economy. That is powerful. The answer is not a Bernie Sanders who says we're going to blow things up. The answer is a guy who says, oh, guess what? I can do even better. His credentials. And not to, this is the guy that has the answer. You need to appeal to, he's a progressive moderate that appeals to suburban women, that appeals to, can get some Reagan Democrats, and can also get those independents. The other candidates, I thought Biden have it, don't have it. He is the hope.
But you say the other candidates don't have it, and Gene Robinson, I don't know if you agree with this, but I'll throw to you. What you say Mike has, Donnie, is money. Like, why is he going to win? He has money. Why is he going to win? He has all this money. And I'm just saying, we're looking at a candidate, just FYI, that has all the money and definitely has some great positions with clear history and body of work of fighting for gun reform. I would love to see that happen. I might even vote for Mike Bloomberg. So I'm torn about this, but I'm just saying this is a candidate who has this stop and frisk stain on his legacy that he's trying to wash away with an apology after years of really disrupting, and that's putting it lightly, the lives of millions of minorities. He's got CEO brain. Let me just do the list here. He just decided he wanted a third term and forced, the city council to change the rules, got it, and then decided he doesn't want anyone else to get a third term, changed him back.
Maybe we need that against Trump.
We actually have that right now, so that's my problem. So buying the election is the third issue. That's the third issue. So we solve the problem with Trump, but are we creating new problems because we're so desperate to beat Trump? I just wonder, because I'm looking at candidates who are truly qualified, who the reason we like them are 4 legitimate reasons that pertain to political positions and hopes and dreams and values. This is based on money.
Well, Mika, first of all, I'm voting for whoever runs against Donald Trump. So, if it's Mike Bloomberg, I'll vote for him as many times as they let me. Just about stop and frisk. I'm a black man in America, so I have been racially profiled. Yeah. It happens that it's never happened to me in New York, but that's just by happenstance. It's happened to me other places. And I know people, friends and people I greatly respect, who, because of their experiences with stop and frisk in New York, really have serious problems with Mike Bloomberg, and I respect that. But I also think, African-American voters are not naive, and they have these experiences. They know that there is racial bias throughout the criminal justice system in this country, and there always have been, and maybe someday there won't be, and that'll be a great thing. But we live in America, and so this happens, and so I think it's a mistake to expect that that African American voters would not apply that broader experience and say, gee, if you look that deeply enough into Amy Klobuchar's record as a prosecutor, and I have great respect for Amy Klobuchar, I'd happily vote for her. If you look at Pete Buttigieg's record as mayor, and again, I would happily vote for him. So I don't think anybody has illusions that there's a perfect candidate. I don't think, frankly, the way Bloomberg defended stop and frisk was obnoxious. I wrote about it at the time. But I don't think many African Americans are going to say, oh, gee, 77-year-old white guy in America who might be a little bit racist, so tell me something else that's new, right? Okay. This is kind of discounted. And now, perhaps for the Democratic Party, maybe the more existential issue is that, he intends to sort of buy this election with all this money and with this very smart organization he's put together. So the real question is this the kind of emergency that I personally think it is? Is it such an emergency that we have to prevent another 4 years of Donald Trump at all costs, that you look past those things and look toward his record on guns, his record on climate change?
I'm just saying, Jonathan Lemire, Michael Bloomberg buys support. He has influence. He's able to get support. And by the way, I'm hearing some black leaders, major black leaders, are going to be supporting him. And he definitely is getting a growing amount of support from the black community, but the policy is worth looking at. It's just an interesting conundrum if he's the candidate.
Certainly, and he is building momentum. And I do think that for so long, Adrian, he sort of loomed over the horizon, right? He's not competing in the first four contests. Right. He's sort of become, for a lot of Democrats who are perhaps not so satisfied with the field, he's sort of the savior who could be coming to rescue them against Donald Trump. But as his entry into the race, his really official entry, which is Super Tuesday in some ways, is approaching. There does seem to be the scrutiny has started. Like the opposition research is being dropped by the other candidates. And certainly he's going to have a major test when it looks like he'll make his first appearance on the debate stage.
I would argue that that's when the race starts.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
So he is someone who is obviously, his retail political skills have never been that strong. He's also rusty. He hasn't run for anything in about a decade. So how do you think he will do? If you were advising him, what would be your strategy? What should his strategy be next week of that debate when he starts taking questions from moderators and other candidates about things like this, like stop and frisk?
Yeah, I mean, look, he first of all, my strategy with him would be get ready. You are going to be the major person who's being attacked on that debate stage from everybody, and deal with it. Don't come across as harsh or defensive. Show contrition and, show a forward-thinking message on what you're going to do for the actual voters in America going forward. I mean, Michael Bloomberg has a lot of strengths, but he's sort of known for not always being, super congenial. So you've got to show that you are serious about this race, which of course we've seen, but also what can you bring to the table and what is your forward-thinking message? I think the real test for Mike Bloomberg is going to be, not just on Super Tuesday, but we're going to, how does Joe Biden do with African-American voters? Obviously, Mike Bloomberg's not on the ballot in South Carolina, but I think if Joe Biden continues, if the support declines among African-American voters in South Carolina, and worst case scenario for Biden, if Bernie Sanders actually does better, if he wins South Carolina, or at least does better among African-American voters in South Carolina, I think that is a good entry point for Mike Bloomberg to get some of those African-American voters, definitively on his side. Right now, they're still sort of trying to figure out, do we stick with Biden? Some of them are going to Sanders, and some are going to Bloomberg. But if Biden has a really poor performance in South Carolina, I think. But I know I've said this a lot, and we've all talked about it a lot. Only 1% of African Americans and Latinos so far in the country in the Democratic Party electorate have voted so far. So, I know there's a lot of momentum that comes out of Iowa and New Hampshire, but if we could just take a step back and realize that Nevada and South Carolina, the first two diverse states. Should we be counting Joe Biden out? I don't think we should. Look, it is. It's difficult, but I don't think we should yet because we do have so many more people to vote for. And if he can show a decent show, he can get a top 3 in Nevada. If he wins South Carolina, I think life is going to be reinvigorated back into his campaign.
We are in an emergency. Who is going to beat Trump? And I love the fact that he's got $10 billion to spend. We are at an emergency.
Yeah. All right, Adrian Elrod, thank you very much. Eugene Robinson, thank you as well. We'll be reading your latest opinion piece in the Washington Post entitled America, the Banana Republic.
Hey, it's MSNBC's Chris Hayes. This week on my podcast, Why Is This Happening? I'll be talking with Jon Favreau about the way to beat Trump.
I feel like too much of the conversation around 2020 in politics is a conversation we're all having with ourselves. So I wanted to do focus groups of people Democrats probably need to win, not just the Obama-Trump voters, but non-voters, sporadic voters, Romney voters, Clinton voters. And then I thought, well, I would go to all the different regions that we need and also talk to the activists and organizers on the ground about how they're trying to persuade these voters.
That's this week on Why Is This Happening? Please search Why Is This Happening wherever you're listening now and subscribe.